The 15th century artistic developments in Italy that we outlined in the previous lecture become fully realized in the 16th century, which accounts for the designations between the early Renaissance and the High Renaissance. Now, there's a few reasons why we make this designation between early and high, and taking a look at them provides us with a helpful context for understanding the art that was produced during this period. One thing that accounts for this designation is that we're looking at work from a new generation of artists. Most of the artists of the early Renaissance have passed away at this point. Another thing that accounts for this designation is that the 16th century, and I would say the late 15th century, was a time of even greater artistic and intellectual inquiry than that of the previous century. In the past, people accepted religious doctrine as truth, and they never questioned what it said. Now they're questioning. They began to study the natural world to an even greater extent, and science began to have an even greater prominence. And this is well reflected in the artwork, which was striving to achieve increasing levels of naturalism and pictorial accuracy. And of course, we can attribute this to the enduring legacy of humanism. This time is like rainbows and purple horseshoes. It's celebrated as a time that's characterized by incredible art, produced by artists who've now become super famous. People like Da Vinci, Raphael, and my personal favorite, Michelangelo. But despite this, there's quite a bit of political and religious turbulence. Again, encouraged by humanism, people begin to question the authority of the Pope, which will lead to a period known as the Reformation, which is a complete game-changer situation that we'll talk about in a later lecture. There also, during this time, were internal conflicts. Most noteworthy is probably the expulsion of the Medici. And then, of course, there are external invasions, mainly that of France into the north. But I know what you're all thinking. The burning question of the ages. What about chronology? The exact dating of the High Renaissance period is subjective, and scholars still debate as to when exactly the High Renaissance began and ended. Here's what I like. I think that it began in 1495 with Da Vinci's Last Supper and ended in 1517, which was the year that Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on a church door, openly criticizing papal policy, the straw that broke the camel's back and ushered in the Reformation. Now, this is a pretty short amount of time, but what's incredible is that amazing art is produced in this very short span of years. Now let's start with the painting that supposedly started it all, the High Renaissance, and that would be Da Vinci's Last Supper. Now this painting was made for the refectory, which was the area where meals are served. And this is a typical location for artworks depicting this religious subject. And in this case, the painting is located in a church in Milan. Here we see Jesus and his 12 apostles, and they're seated at a long table that is set perfectly parallel to the picture plane. It's a very intellectual and rational compositional choice. The other thing is the table is placed in a simple, spacious room, where you have this austere setting that really heightens the dramatic action, making the goings-on at the table really the point of focus. All of this is happening within a setting that's reminiscent of classical architecture. We have an emphasis on geometric symmetry. We've got our coffered ceiling up in here. And we all know by now that it is a fundamental characteristic of Renaissance art to have that stylistic nod to classicism. And this is going to become even more pronounced in the High Renaissance than what we saw in the Italian early Renaissance. Now, Jesus is here in the middle, and with his outstretched hands, he has just told the men at the table that one of them there will betray him. And we're seeing the figures react to this news with a variety of emotion. Now, again, thank you to Giotto for institutionalizing this idea of expressing emotion, where you're using these varying emotions to define a sense of individuality, which is a very humanist thing to do. In the center, Jesus appears isolated from his disciples, and he sits still. This is in contrast to the swirl of movement around him. His figure is emphasized by the background architectural element, mainly a window, which frames his head and really works to help make Jesus the focal point of this piece. And of course, the central positioning and the positioning of the figures, the implied lines, all of these things contribute to this focal point. Now, let me ask you a question. To create this rational and intellectually ordered composition, what perspective did Da Vinci use? Now, if you need to, this is always important to practice, pause the video, go back in your notes, and see if you can find the answer to this question. If you said 1-point frontal perspective, you would be correct. And remember, when we identify linear perspective, we're not only identifying the vanishing point, how many points does the space recede to, but also the direction of that recession as well. So we have disciples, and they are grouped in 4 groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they're united amongst themselves by their gestures and their postures. Now here, Da Vinci actually went against traditional iconography by placing Judas on the same side of the table as Jesus and the rest of the disciples. Can you tell which one he is? We can tell who he is because he's the only one, this is him right here. He's the only one whose face is in the shadow, which makes him all sketchy and shady. And that symbolizes his evil. And then also notice how he leans away from Jesus, a posture that also is making him distinct from the other disciples. Now, when we look at all of these disciples, we see a broad range of emotions, from fear to doubt to rage to love. The 2 disciples at the end of the table, this one and this one, they're more quiet than the others, and they're more still, as if to bracket the energy of the composition, which grows more intense as it moves towards Jesus. Now, the arrangement of these figures is not only simply a compositional device, it's symbolic as well. The number of the figures in each group is 3. 3 references the Christian Trinity. You also have the number of groups 4, which references the 4 earthly elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Now, let's look at another interpretation of the same subject. This one is an impressive work that was created by a nun who was self-taught. She did not receive formal training. So she is relying on her natural artistic abilities, which I think is super impressive. And the other important tidbit of information about this artist is she is the first known female painter of the Italian Renaissance in Florence. So Nellie, she was known especially for her large-scale devotional paintings. And take a look at the dimensions here. They're pretty big. Right, 21 feet by 6.5 feet. And this translates to figures that are life-size. Wow. Now, she is taking the more traditional approach that Da Vinci had departed from by putting Judas on the other side of the table. But similar to Da Vinci, the legacy of Giotto continues to become apparent, where she too is expressing emotion that's really appropriate for such a heart-wrenching scene. Let's look at a detail. For me, the emotional resonance really lies here in this tender interaction, and it really underscores the intimate spiritual relationship that existed between Jesus and his disciples. Now, I've read scholarship by Renaissance art historians who argue that the figures in this scene, we'll go back to take a look at all of them, that the figures in this scene, they have more of a feminine appearance. And this is something that they say is more typical of the majority of her work. Now, I'm not exactly sure to what extent I agree with this. Again, we can look here, and maybe I'm missing something, but I'm just not quite seeing this, except for maybe here, which is why I keep returning to this one image here. Now, art historians attribute this feminizing to the fact that, like other female artists, Nellie would not have been permitted to study the nude male body, and therefore she had an unfamiliarity with its form. It actually wouldn't be until much later in the 19th century, hundreds of years later, that female artists would finally be able to study the form of the male nude. Now, as scholarship continues to develop, it is becoming more and more apparent that there were a number of female artists who enjoyed a vibrant output of significant art historical work during the Renaissance and the following Baroque period. But the details of this really do remain elusive, and this probably is because the cultural and social limitations that were imposed on women during the 14th, the 15th, and the 16th century really institutionalized their roles first and foremost as wives and mothers, not exactly as professionals. Now, from my point of view, and I am not a Renaissance art historian, my allegiance lies to the Minoans. But from my point of view, there still is a lot of work that needs to be done to better understand the practice of female artists during the Italian Renaissance. It's not until the work produced in the later Mannerist and Baroque periods, particularly in terms of portraiture, that female artists really start to become more visible in art history. I think the artists were there prior to those periods. I just don't think we've found them yet. We need to keep looking. And can we just talk for a minute about the creepy hairy animal that they're eating for dinner? Did anyone else notice that? It looks like some sort of rodent or a baby javelina. But I think most likely what this is a lamb. Typically that is what's shown as the meal served with the Last Supper. I guess I'm not seeing it because I think of lambs as like white and fluffy and cute, not creepy, hairy. But anyways, it would work that from an iconographical standpoint that we're seeing the lamb as the meal because that reinforces the sacrifice that Jesus is about to undertake, the sacrifice that came from his willing martyrdom, which he was announcing at this Last Supper. Now, of course, we can't have a discussion of the High Renaissance or Leonardo da Vinci without mentioning the Mona Lisa, which is probably the most well-known painting in the entire history of art. Why do you think this is so well known? I think it is because it's such an enigmatic and mysterious painting. And so let's ask ourselves, okay, what makes it so enigmatic? What makes it so mysterious? Well, the big thing that everyone talks about is the smile, right? She has this smile. It's like a weird smile, though, that's kind of hard to interpret. It's like maybe like a happy smile or maybe like a mischievous smile, or it's not super clear what the facial expression is communicating. We do see her, though, sitting serenely with her hands on her lap, and she sits in front of this nondescript landscape. And it even has this like kind of mysterious road that sort of like leads to nowhere. She looks directly at the viewer, again with this sort of ambiguous smile, and it really does create this point of psychological interest. I think something else that adds to the mystery and ambiguity of this piece is the particular technique that Da Vinci used called sfumato. And sfumato involves shading, this manipulation of light and shadow, but it has a kind of smoky effect and a hazy effect. And you can kind of see it like in here and right along here, some examples of where he's using this technique. Now, people maybe are also into the fact that there's some actual mystery surrounding this painting. It's cool and it's interesting that this painting was stolen, right? And then it just like turns up again. There's also these like legends and conspiracy theories, like how this is actually a portrait of Da Vinci, or I personally think this is a portrait of an alien. And no one even really knows who this person is. As of now, the agreed upon identity among scholars is that it's a wealthy Florentine merchant's wife, but nobody can be more specific than this. People are so concerned as to who this person is that there was some poor woman in Italy who was actually dug up so that they could test her DNA to see if she was in fact Mona Lisa. Now, I try really hard to be an unbiased professor for you. And it's an endeavor in which I think I'm only marginally successful. Sorry, I love art and have a lot to say. And I can't help it here. I have to be honest with you. I think this painting is super whatever. And so, of course, it's bugging me. This is what keeps me up every single night, that this is the most famous painting of all time when it's actually kind of basic. Why? Here's a picture. It's a picture of me years ago at the Louvre, the museum in France where the Mona Lisa is hung. It's kind of like a Where's Waldo situation. Here I am in this sea of people. The Louvre has so many incredible works of art. The Louvre has the Lamassu. The Louvre has the Stele of Hammurabi. The Louvre has the Venus de Milo. It has the Egyptian seated scribe. And I'm just like naming a few things off the top of my head that you might be familiar with Art 200. There's even more. And all these people instead are crammed into this room to see this little painting here. It's a portrait. Take a look at any of the Mannerist portraits by Bronzino or by Angulosa, and you'll learn about them in our Mannerist lecture. They blow the doors off this painting in their psychological, their technical, and their compositional complexity. Now, I'm not saying Mona Lisa is irrelevant, because it is portraiture, and that certainly is reflecting the emphasis on individuality that is, of course, as we well know by now, informed by humanism. And we know this characterizes the style of the Renaissance. But I'm also saying that just because an artwork is famous doesn't mean that you have to jump on the bandwagon too. You can stop people in the streets, and after you watch the Mannerist lecture, say to people, "Excuse me, I know you know about the Mona Lisa, but can I please tell you about the portraiture of Bronzino?" And together we can take back the history of art. One thing you're going to learn about me, if you don't already know this, is that I'm oversensitive to that which is wildly popular on a superficial level, really to the detriment of that which really is making significant contributions to the history of art. And if you don't see that now, you're totally going to get that sense when we get to Picasso. And I apologize in advance. Now, while Da Vinci did some great artwork, it's my opinion that Michelangelo was the true hero of the High Renaissance. And you know what? He's probably the best sculptor who ever lived, and actually the best sculptor ever to grace our humble planet. Yeah, I know that's a bold claim, but you know what? I'm going to make it. And I'm not sorry about it, because you're going to see this for yourself in about 5 seconds. First of all, we're looking at his Pietà. This is one of his earlier works. You want to know how old Michelangelo was when he made this? 25. Pretty young. And this is one of his earlier attempts at sculpture where he really had not developed his practice yet. So he's basically just kind of like learning, initially exploring, what's this artwork or this art form of sculpture all about? And then he just busts out one of the most sophisticated and moving sculptures ever created. No big deal. Pietà is the Italian word for pity, and the word is used to refer to art images that depict the Virgin Mary holding and mourning her deceased son after he's been murdered, and he's been martyred, and he's been taken down from the cross. Now, Pietàs are not new to the High Renaissance. They've long been popular in Northern Europe, but they were actually, I will say, rare in Italian art at the time. Now keep in mind that the Pietà is showing Mary holding her adult son. And if she's holding her son with people surrounding her, that technically is not the Pietà. That's the Lamentation. And we saw an incredible example of this with Giotto's rendition in the Arena Chapel. Now if she's sitting there holding a strange-looking man-baby homunculus Jesus, then it's going to be the throne or the seat of wisdom. So the Pietà is just Mary by herself holding her deceased son. Now, you have with this sculpture such a simple beauty, and it has a serenity that's flawlessly incorporated within a deep sense of sadness. It's like the serenity and the beauty almost enhances that sadness. Now, I know this sounds kind of woo-woo, but I'm going to tell you something. I've seen this work in person at this point 3 times. It's located at the Vatican, St. Peter's in Rome. And to see it in person is literally breathtaking. I do not understand why or how this is, but this serenity, this peace, you actually physically feel it. It radiates off the sculpture. Now, I personally think stone has the ability to be a conduit for energy, and I think that Michelangelo, in all of his greatness, somehow is able to channel this and have it somehow come out at the sculpture. Again, I don't know how this works. All I know is how I have felt every single time that I have looked at this sculpture. And even though this is a super sad sculpture, I feel that peace and I feel that serenity. I seriously almost want to start crying right now when I think back to these memories. Now, there's an issue with the Pietà. There's a problem in general, not just this sculpture. So the Pietà is this idea of Mary holding her adult son in her lap, cradling him, right? Now, it's kind of hard to show an adult woman cradling an adult man the way that a mother might cradle an infant. Now, this idea of cradling is super important, okay? Because it's really focusing on this idea of experiencing the loss of her son. Now, I myself don't have children, but I cannot imagine the devastation that one would feel losing their son. And not only losing their son, but she witnessed her son murdered and tortured publicly as people cheered this on. So she witnesses that, and then she has a few brief moments. These are the last moments that she gets to be a mother to this man. And so she cradles him as she cradled him as a baby. And that cradling gesture, think about that. It's intimate, it's close, it's loving, it's nurturing, it's emotionally intimate. All of these things that we readily think of when we think about our own mothers. So this idea of cradling is so important for the emotional resonance of this subject. But again, how can an artist depict this scene of a woman holding close to her a grown man the way she would cradle an infant without it looking weird and awkward? This question had plagued artists always. Even the incredible trailblazer Giotto, go back and look at his Lamentation. Same thing. She doesn't even hold him in her lap. She has to kind of hold him at the top with the head. Now, Michelangelo solved this quandary by alternating the human proportions of Mary's figure. He made the heads of the two figures the same size. And we can tell this by comparing the heads, right? So you can see the two heads. We can tell that this is making them both adults, right? So we get that idea. But what he did, and you can see it actually if you look closely, is he enlarged Mary's body in relation to the size of Jesus. So what he did is Michelangelo elongated the legs and then substantially widened the hips so that her body could contain the length of her son. Then he disguised all of this proportional irregularity under immense folds of drapery. Gosh, so brilliant. You see that her seated figure spreads out to support the almost horizontal curve of Jesus's limp body. Now, an art historian came in and measured these proportions, and according to these proportions, it was determined that if Mary stood up, she would be about 8 feet tall. And then we have David, right? It just keeps getting better and better with Michelangelo and his sculpture. So listen to this little story. So it's 1501, okay, shortly after creating the Pietà. So we're still looking at Michelangelo as a young man, super early in his career, just learning about sculpture, okay? So he comes across this large piece of marble that was thrown in the trash. What had happened was there was a sculptor who cut too far into the marble, and he said, this marble is ruined, it can't be used, throw it in the trash. Now, Michelangelo is really wanting to work on his sculpture, but he doesn't really have many patrons. And so he finds this piece of trash. He asks the Florence Building Commission, who owns the trash, hey, can I have this marble? And they said, yeah, like trash, go ahead, take it. And so he just takes this piece of trash and pretty much just turns it into one of the most famous sculptures ever made. And this one is very rightly famous, because it's incredible. Now, with this sculpture, we get the sense of Michelangelo's understanding of the ideal human form in the classical sense. Does this sculpture look familiar to you? It should, because it looks really familiar to Polyclitus's Doryphorus. You've got this nicely sculpted, emphasized musculature in both, a contrapposto stance, poking forward knee, right, to create the weight shift principle, and then the blank, youthful face that turns away from the viewer. We also see a clear reference to classical Greek sculpture's emphasis on the heroic nude with Michelangelo's David. And once again, similar to Donatello's David, it's being translated, the heroic nude, into biblical subject matter. This reference to classical antiquity is super important in terms of the trajectory of Michelangelo's career, because this classical aesthetic thoroughly appealed to Pope Julius II, who associated himself with not only the humanists, but with the Roman emperors as well. And we know that Roman artistic and intellectual culture was considered an extension of Greece. So this statue was especially important for Michelangelo because it called the artist to the Pope's attention. And what we will see is it's going to lead to very major papal commissions. Now let's bring in this sculpture. So, we know that the work depicts a biblical subject matter, but that it also has a political dimension as well, which is appropriate for the context. Remember, at the beginning of lecture, I told you about the political and religious turmoil that characterized this period. At the time, the stability of the Republic of Florence was in jeopardy, right? Now, again, we know the story. David had to fight Goliath. He's a giant. He's going to lose because he's going up against a giant, right? But instead of, using his physical abilities, which was a complete disadvantage, David won by using his intellect, right? By having that slingshot, throwing the rock at Goliath's head. So the Florentines, as you know, viewed David as the symbolic, defiant hero of the Florentine Republic. He was intended as a symbol of liberty, of justice, integrity. And this association was heightened by the placement of the work. It was placed just outside of the door of the Palazzo della Signora, which was the civic center, the place where the town meetings were held. And if you go to Florence today and you go to the Palazzo Vecchio, where this building is located, you will see a replica of this sculpture standing in what was the original position. Now we have the original sculpture housed safely in the Accademia Museum, also in Florence. Now, this was also meant to be a representation of the relationship that the Florentines perceived they had with the Pope. Remember, he was trying to involve himself in Florentine politics, and the Florentines saw themselves as the little guys in the face of the power of the giant, which in this case was the papacy. Now, if we do a brief comparison with Donatello's version of the same subject, we can see why art historians differentiate between the early and the high Renaissance. We can see that there is much more of an emphasis on the classical influence in the high Renaissance in comparison to our early Renaissance iteration over here. Now, despite the traditional association of David with heroism, Michelangelo chose to represent David not after the victory as the heroic victor with Goliath's head at the feet. And remember, choice is super significant. This is what Donatello chose to do, heroic victor after the fact. But look at Michelangelo. Instead, he has David right before the battle commences, turning his head, watching his approaching foe. His face, as well as his muscular body, is tense, with the gathering power, probably that surge of adrenaline. We see the physical strength of the figure in his muscular torso, sturdy limbs, and look at these very large, disproportionately large hands. All of these things really work to give this piece a strong physical and symbolic presence. Now I'm going to tell you something. When I was younger, I was an art historian in training. I was a junior in college, and I took my first trip to Europe. And I'm in Florence, right? And I actually, when I first started studying art history, I was not a fan of David by Michelangelo. And I was unimpressed because I had studied Greek sculpture and already had seen 5 million nude sculptures This one to me was old news, right? I obviously had a lot still to learn. So anyways, I go to Florence and I thought, okay, well, out of obligation, because I'm an art historian in training, I will go and I will see this in person, right? So I go to the academia, even though, I don't really want to. Again, I have a lot to learn. And the way it's set up is there's like a long hallway. And then at the end of the hallway, in its own little space, is David. And so I turn the corner and I was like far away from the sculpture and immediately just like, oh my gosh, like reacted to it and felt myself sort of being pulled towards this sculpture. Now, on the long hallway, there's all these incredible sculptures of these unfinished images that Michelangelo had sculpted of slaves who are like twisting and turning. And these are amazing in themselves. Didn't even look at them. Don't care. I am like being pulled towards this David sculpture. I have never, well, actually, I take that back. At the time, I had never been faced with such a sculpture that exuded a sense of power and physical presence. And the only other time I ever felt this is when I saw in person the equestrian portrait of Marcus Aurelius, which I didn't see that until like 15 years later or something. Anyways, you could feel the power, you could feel the strength coming off of this sculpture. It was incredible. There were people that were looking at the sculpture and just crying. And I understood why. It is the most powerful sculpture. And again, I don't know how Michelangelo can do this, to take stone and to have it communicate these energies that you literally can feel. Now, in comparing Michelangelo's to Donatello's David, you can see that because of the choice of subject and when Michelangelo chose the part of the story to show, it makes it more dramatic, that sense of tension. It involves the viewer, because here we're like, okay, David already won. But here we have we have him and he's waiting and the foe is approaching, the battle's happening. We're not sure at this moment what's going to happen. Is David going to prevail? Is the giant going to prevail? We don't know. And our imagination wants to kind of continue on with that narrative. And so we're pulled into the psychological intensity in a way that's not really happening with Donatello's David. And this is important, this idea of drama and tension and emotionalism, because it does signify things to come. We're going to see this coming in big time when we get to the Italian Baroque period, which is coming up, and we're going to see this by being really utilized by an incredible sculptor, maybe the second best sculptor who ever lived, and that would be Bernini. And you'll see that again coming up soon. There's Polyclitus Doryphorus again. Not sure why I have it in there, but we get the idea, right? The idea of classical influence. Let's move on to the Sistine Chapel. Because again, we haven't seen enough good art. Pietà, David, now we've got the Sistine Chapel. Now I want to talk about Pope Julius II for a minute. He was an individual whose interests and activities significantly affected the course of the High Renaissance. He was an avid art patron, and he understood well the propagandistic value of visual imagery. He was especially attracted to art that was a visual reference to classical antiquity, so that he could be associated with the power of the ancient Roman emperors and the cultural splendor of ancient Rome and Greece, and also the intellectual vibrancy that characterized Rome and even more so Greece in the classical period. Now, after his election as Pope, Julius II immediately commissioned artworks that would present to people this authoritative image of his rule and reinforce his authority over the Catholic Church as well. And many of these were large-scale projects that required quite a bit of financial resources. So he's spending all this money and he's living this really lavish lifestyle at the same time, and people aren't exactly happy about this. Where does this money come from for him to live like a king and commission all this art? The church was participating in revenue generating practices, and this is not new. We learned about this in Art 200. things like selling off pieces of the church, like windows, selling off or renting out the space of radiating chapels. Another example are indulgences. And basically what this is if you do something bad, you could pay for it and your sins would be forgiven. And this is the kind of stuff that was funding the papal art, the architecture, the lavish lifestyle. And this doesn't really seem quite fair. That if you're rich and you have extra money, you can be like totally a piece of crap person, pay some money, your sins are forgiven, you're into heaven. Where if you're, a poor person, you do the best you can, you don't have extra money to pay for your sins to be forgiven, and it's still a question as to whether or not you're going to go to heaven. One, that doesn't seem fair, and two, that doesn't seem very Christian. So again, we're starting to see this idea of people being disgruntled, and this is going to explain why the Reformation is going to happen. Now, before Julius II died, he commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. And this was a commission that Michelangelo did not want to accept because he insisted he was not a painter. But you know what Julius II did? He emotionally blackmailed Michelangelo. Michelangelo loved sculpture. It was like marble was going through his veins, right? That's what he lived for, was sculpture. And Julius II said to Michelangelo, if you don't paint the Sistine Chapel, I will never commission you for any sculpture. What was Michelangelo going to do? The Pope, the papacy, was one of the main sources of patronage for artists in Italy. He had to take the commission. So he simply just did what he had to do. Now there's great difficulties that Michelangelo faced when painting this ceiling, aside from the fact that he supposedly wasn't a painter. First of all, he was inexperienced with the fresco technique, painting on plaster. Not only that, but he had to paint on these really high curved walls, okay, which actually had to have custom scaffolding built. And it forced Michelangelo to kind of like lay and position himself in these like really contorted positions for extended period of time. So it's physically demanding as well. This vault is huge, right? So he had to fill a vast surface with images. And he had to incorporate the images within pre-existing paintings, which are these down in here, which were made by pre-Renaissance artists Perugino and Botticelli. Then he also had the architecture of the space, particularly the clerestory windows that we see up here, that he also had to incorporate into as well. So there's a lot that we've got going on here in terms of this being an uphill battle. Michelangelo's not a painter. He has to paint high up. It's physically demanding. It's a huge space. He has to work with pre-existing images. He has to work with pre-existing architecture. And basically, he faces all of this not being a painter and makes the most incredible mural painting probably in the history of art. No big deal. And because he's a total boss, he did this in less than 4 years, creating this monumental fresco that depicts the creation, the fall of Adam and Eve, and the redemption of humanity. Let's take a look at a detail. It's a long sequence of narrative panels, and they describe the creation, and that runs along the crown of the vault here. Vault, this term refers to a curved ceiling. We see that we have here God creating the heavens, the earth. We've got God creating man. We've got here he's creating Eve. We've got Adam and Eve tempted. They have been expelled from the garden. And then back in here is the story of Noah and the flood, right? Where God has to send a flood to kind of wash away all the sin that pervades the earth, because Adam and Eve sort of opened the door for sin on this planet by sinning and eating from the forbidden tree of knowledge. So a lot going on here. And we're supposed to look at it from this way, right? When we come into this space. Now, what we also have, though, is down in here, these are kind of like seers, people who can foretell the future, prophets. There's some pagan sibyls in here as well. They foretold the coming of Christ. So they kind of relate to, again, the sort of redemptive aspect of humanity that comes after all of this business up in here. So what we have all together is this very sweeping sort of tale of Christianity and its history. Now, what we have is we have all of this in here. It's kind of looking like trompe l'oeil, right? Fooling the eye. All this architecture, all this is painted in. And he paints in the architecture to separate these different representations. I feel like we have seen this before. This idea of using painted in architecture to separate scenes. Oh yeah, that's right. Giotto's Arena Chapel. So here we see even the great Michelangelo being inspired by Giotto. Now, one thing I want to point out is the way that these figures are represented. And I do encourage you to look at details of these on your own to really get a closer view. But if you look, you can see the musculature of these figures, even like Eve. There's one where she's like super ripped. It's like right in here maybe. These muscles, right? Or here, look at that bicep of Eve, right? So everyone's really musculature. This is, I think, kind of maybe like a workaround, or Michelangelo trying to kind of like come to terms with the fact that he can't make sculpture for a while. And what he does, and I think this is brilliant, is he really kind of like retranslates three-dimensional form into a two-dimensional format. You've got the musculature, you've got the vitality, you've got that sense of life that we saw in sculptures such as his David, and these are appearing. They appear as though they are painted sculpture. Now, you have an emphasis on musculature. You have an emphasis on these interesting positions of the body. And what this conveys to us is that Michelangelo did indeed have an understanding of the human body. And in fact, we believe that it's a very intimate understanding of the human body that was based off of direct observation. What he did, and this was taboo and this was illegal, is he would break into morgues and he would study dead bodies. He would look at these cut open bodies and he would move them to see from the inside how tendons worked, how muscles flexed, and he used that to inform his understanding of the human body and depicting that. Now, the Last Judgment. Before we look at this, I want to go back for 1 minute to show you the spatial context. This is the Last Judgment on this wall here. Here it is again. Now, he didn't paint this alongside the ceiling. He painted this about 25 years later, where he was called back to paint this on the wall behind the altar. Now, at this point, Julius II had long passed away. This painting was commissioned by Pope Clement VII, who died, and in the time it took to paint this painting, it was finished under the Pope Paul III. Now, take a look at the date of 1536. Michelangelo actually painted this during the time of the Reformation, which you know we're going to talk more about later. This was a time where the Western world was really undergoing a spiritual and political crisis because the Reformation was essentially the splitting of Christendom. Imagine this, you have a religion that was completely dominant politically, economically, socially, culturally for 1,000 years. This was all people knew. This was what mediated their entire life. And then all of a sudden, it is split up, right? That is going to make people feel really scared, really uncomfortable. It's going to take away people's sense of security. This was really, really a psychological and a spiritual challenge to have Christendom split up in this way. Now, with this in mind, you can see, I put it here, that this work is associated with mannerism. Now, at this point, you have no clue what I'm talking about, and that's okay. Just put this in your notes, and when you go back to study this image later, you're going to definitely know what this is referring to. Now, the idea with this painting being produced during this time of spiritual turmoil is reflected in the mood of the work. Look at this work carefully. Look at the figures carefully. We've moved away from that radiant energy and vitality and life of the ceiling to a more somber painting on the wall. We've got Jesus coming back, and he is, again, grumpy, angry Jesus, deciding who goes to heaven, who goes to hell. right? We get the sense of spiritual agony. Even the people that get to go to heaven kind of like turned in these almost like painful contortions. And it's even more so painful and awkward over here with the people that have been damned to hell. These are really also very unique and oblique views, right? Kind of interesting to see people with their backs to us, right? In this way, sort of awkwardly in the process of moving. And again, I feel like we've seen this before, showing these figures in these really unorthodox and unexpected ways. Where have we seen that? Oh, that's right. We saw it with Giotto's Arena Chapel, right? Again, we see the legacy of Giotto. It cannot be denied. Now, we have here something else that's interesting. This right here, okay, is we've got St. Bartholomew. And what's happening is he was martyred by being skinned alive, which I imagine would be a particularly painful way for one to go, and he's holding his flayed skin here in his hand. Now, what art historians discovered, and this was, I think, maybe a couple decades ago at this point, is that this face here is actually a subtle self-portrait of Michelangelo. And that's really interesting that he chose to present himself in such a grim manner. What some art historians interpret is that this was an expression of his own feelings of spiritual and psychological turmoil that were caused by the Reformation. It also could be, he's becoming this older man at this point. Maybe someone just kind of taking an honest look at one's life as they age, and that's kind of a hard thing to do. And maybe, it's reflecting those struggles as well. It gives us a nice peek, though, into the psychology of the hero Michelangelo. All right, we have one more. We have the School of Athens. Now, while Michelangelo was working on the Sistine Chapel the first time around, Pope Julius II also wanted to have his papal apartments decorated as well. And so he commissioned the artist Raphael to paint the papal library. Now, in this library, on each of the four walls, he wanted Raphael to paint images that fell under the four categories of learning as it was understood by the Western world at this time. These categories were theology, justice, poetry, and philosophy. And we see the philosophy image here. Together, again, this is embodying learning in its totality. It's referring to the four branches of human knowledge and wisdom. And because of this location inside of the library, it functions to point out the virtues and the learning appropriate to a pope, to show how intelligent Pope Julius II was. And by the way, cultured, and by the way, wise, and by the way, a divinely ordained religious authority. Now, in this work, the setting is not a school per se, as we might think of it. School, when we talk about it in terms of art, is referring to a group, a congregation. Often we refer to schools of artists. In this case, this is a congregation or a school of great philosophers and scientists of the ancient world, people who actually lived. Raphael depicted these scholars as conversing, sharing ideas, explaining their various theories to one another. And they stand in this vast hall that's covered by massive vaults that recall ancient classical architecture. The central figures here are Plato and Aristotle, and then all the other figures are arranged carefully around them. So Plato holds a book that he has written, and he points to heaven, right? And this is the source of his inspiration, the cosmos. While Aristotle here, he is carrying the book that he has written and points to the earth, which is the area from which his observations of reality spring. Now, on the sides of Plato stand the philosophers and scientists who are most concerned with the mysteries that transcend the earthly realm. And on the side of Aristotle, over here, these are the philosophers and scientists who are most concerned with nature and human affairs. Now, if someone told me, and I wouldn't appreciate this, but if someone told me that I had to teach the High Renaissance using only one image, despite the greatness of Michelangelo, actually this would be the image I would choose. And the reason why is because in a single image, this encapsulates pretty much every single thing that is stylistically significant about Renaissance painting. First, from a compositional standpoint, we see that it is well organized. It is structured. It's a unified composition. Everything is very carefully and intellectually considered. There's no accidents. There's no coincidences, okay? Now, remember that kind of rational approach, which also don't forget, we have also some linear perspective in here, 1-point frontal recession. This approach of being very rational, very intellectual in the putting together of a work of art, remember that's very humanist, right? That placement of education. Look at the architectural setting. Classical, right? Classical architectural setting. Look at the subjects themselves. Classical, right? The placement of the figures. This is all very rationally thought out, creating this elliptical sort of shape that keeps the viewer sort of moving around the composition here, right? So you've got that. And then we also have all of these different individual treatments of each form to underscore this notion of individuality, right? And then also another thing I want to mention is not only are these individuals who are from the classical period, they're also thinkers, they're scientists, they're philosophers. So again, we have that humanist emphasis on education. There is a sense of naturalism here, there's a sense of realism here. All of this together, this is totally textbook High Renaissance. Now, on this topic of individualism, we know we can relate this to portraiture. And what's interesting about this painting is that there actually are portraits of Renaissance artists who actually lived and worked at the time that are presented in the guise of these well-known philosophers, thinkers, scientists. So this actually is a portrait of Da Vinci here. And this is the artist Sangallo. He is an early Renaissance artist here. This is the portrait of Michelangelo. And we have Michelangelo here shown very pouty. He's brooding. And this supposedly is an accurate reflection of the personality of Michelangelo. He was very antisocial. And you know why? He's busy. He is too busy making sculpture to chit-chat with people about the weather. And he's not sorry about that. But people didn't understand that. They took it the wrong way. They took it personal. Michelangelo is such a jerk. And actually, a lot of art historians think that Raphael and Michelangelo were one of the great rivalries of art history. And supposedly even at some point, Michelangelo punched Raphael in the face or something like that. Over here, this bald guy bending down, this is Bramante. Bramante actually was active at the same time as Raphael and Michelangelo at this site of St. Peter's. Michelangelo is painting the Sistine Chapel, okay, which is not St. Peter's, but the Vatican right next door, right? As well as the papal apartments too. So Michelangelo's doing the Sistine Chapel right next to St. Peter's. We have Raphael doing School of Athens, the papal apartments right next to St. Peter's. And in St. Peter's, this most significant church in all of Christendom, that is the Pope's personal church, that is being designed by Bramante. Now, here's something interesting for you. So Bramante dies, right? And they have not finished the church. What is one to do? The Pope says to Michelangelo, I want you to design the dome. So Michelangelo is not just an amazing sculptor, an amazing painter. He happens to be an amazing architect even. And if you go to Rome today, you go to the Vatican, you see St. Peter's, that dome, Michelangelo did it. The guy is just out of control. And then finally, this is Bramante. Look at this guy. The only guy in the whole painting that looks straight out at the viewer. That's Raphael. I like this. I like the humility here because I could see Raphael being like, oh, I'm going to put myself right here, front and center, right? Show how important I am and right next to Da Vinci and all of this. But no, he's very discreet, and I appreciate that humility on the part of Raphael. This concludes our lecture on the High Renaissance in Italy.